Hi, I'm Mitchell Kopich. I'm the founder and final chairman here at the Academy of Aesthetic Musings. And welcome back to Season 2 of the Oscarinas. I want to kick off this video by saying a huge thank you to all of our new subscribers. Since last season, we saw a boost of more than 50 new subscribers for a total of 90, and that number continues to climb. So thank you all for joining us, and now, a word from our sponsors. In this upcoming season, we're going to be covering games from the years 1992 and 1993. The nominations will be announced in the first week of September, after which each game with 3 or more nominations will receive its own special analysis and nomination coverage video to be released steadily throughout the month. There's been a lot happening behind the scenes, however, so I want to take this chance to update everybody on some of the new rules changes, category revisions, and hint at some of the surprises to come. I'll close things out by revealing the shortlist, and that will give us a glimpse as to what we might expect to see for nominations, so stay tuned for that. Now, before I go on, I just want to take a quick minute to update everyone and let them know that I have a Patreon account set up for the Oscarinas with some benefits, including your name at the end of credits for major videos and Discord access where you can hang out with my friends and I, as well as see additional behind-the-scenes content and early updates on shortlists, nominees, and other announcements. In fact, if you sign up, you can see the entire ballot on Discord itself right now. As I said before, we're a small but growing channel, so talking about our videos and sharing it with others is really the best support you can give us for right now. But if you'd like to support me in a more immediate way, I don't want that support to go unnoticed either. There will be a link to my Patreon account in the description below, thanks in advance. And now, let's talk about the awards. So the first item I want to address is that we're going to be treating this season as if you've already watched Season 1, so we may at times refer to games that performed well, what they won, and so forth. So if you're brand new and you don't want to hear spoilers, I'd recommend going back and watching through last season, at least the winner's ceremony, so you're up to date. Alright, let's talk about some of the new rulings. Now these are mostly clarifying details, but they are important to bring everyone up to speed. You might want to check timestamps because I'm going to have to be really nuanced here, but I'll do my best to hold your hand. Sometimes there are different ports or different versions of games, and not all of these ports are created equal. This came up in particular with this season's Doom, a game that was a smash hit back in the 90s, for good reason. But when people talk about Doom, they're not usually talking about its many butchered ports. They're talking about the original MS-DOS, which can still be played via Steam. That version also comes with an enhanced variant built in. It preserves the game well, modernizes the controls, improves the resolution, and widens the aspect ratio. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, would it be fair to use this enhanced version? Ideally, games would all release as one simple variant. Even director's cuts for films, while offering differences, generally preserve the original quality of the basic message. Games seem to be a little different though. Is it fair to nominate Doom for something like Best Interface while using the updated control scheme provided in the Steam enhancement? That is the question we're trying to answer. On the one hand, it makes comparisons with other nominees unfair because not every game will necessarily have updated controls themselves. However, anyone who plays Doom nowadays based on our recommendations will more than likely be playing with the updated control scheme. So if we limit ourselves to the original, haven't we essentially just lied to our audience about how the game actually controls? Not only this, but you have to consider the fact that we aren't living in 1993 anymore. Our sensibilities have changed. Perhaps Doom's controls may have felt great back in the day. After all, could it realistically have been so well regarded if its controls were so tremendously flawed? And finally, we have to account for the fact that the voters are not required to even play these games. Some exposure is expected, of course, but it is an honor system. Just because you don't play a game doesn't mean you can't have an opinion about it. In fact, there are some games where my appreciation of them is actually better the less I play of them. Doom is once again my example. I get motion sickness if I play the game too long, but that's obviously more of a problem with myself than it is with the game. If I force myself to play Doom more than what I need to gain my impression of it, I'll just be making myself sick and have to work all the harder to push aside my physical bias that's actively sabotaging my enjoyment. And this isn't even accounting for the fact that the different versions of Doom have released in different years. We could, for example, safely go with the original MS-DOS version of Doom in 1993 and call it a day, which is what we're going to do. But in this case, it will unfortunately have a knock-on effect in that it prevents the rare instance in which superior quality in a different version won't be eligible. The Doom soundtrack on the 3DO, for instance, is, in the Academy's view, the definitive Doom soundtrack. I mean, just listen to this madness. Yeah, that won't get to compete, unfortunately. But this will. Clearly a step down. If we did allow for the 3DO version only for music and not for its atrocious gameplay, then we've basically presented a backwards argument. In effect, our message would be that you should play the MS-DOS version of Doom while listening to the Doom 3DO version of its soundtrack. That very well might be the most ideal way to play, but really, who's gonna bother with all that? And honestly, we'd be recommending a hypothetical version of Doom that doesn't actually exist. So, at the cost of a downgraded soundtrack, we've settled on the 1993 MS-DOS version of Doom, and from now on, all games must submit a single version to compete for the awards in which all criteria is measured, except one exception, which I will discuss later. Okay, so this solves the problem of bad ports, but what about better ones? Imagine a series like, say Pokemon. In Pokemon games, many of them have a unique version of the game that releases shortly after the first two. This third version, your Yellows, Crystals, and Emeralds, come with enhanced UIs, story changes, and quality of life improvements. Pokemon Crystal is especially relevant here since it was the first Pokemon game to allow you to play as a girl. That is huge. I mean, that fundamentally changes the game's standing in a category like Best Gameplay, Discovery, and Expression, because the self-expression in the game is now greatly enhanced. Gold and Silver released in 1999 in Japan. Crystal releases the year later. And here's the thing, we're not nominating the same game twice just because of one added feature, no matter how important that feature is. Why? Because we have a plethora of games to talk about. We are already bursting the seams by only allowing 5 nominees across 2 years, an absolute cutthroat proposition. So what we decided was, yes, one version and one version only gets to compete. The year of competition must pertain to the earliest console or PC-based release. However, we have added an amendment to the rule to allow versions that released within 5 years of the competing date to compete in their stead. As such, more than likely, Pokemon Gold and Silver will be eligible to compete at the Oscarinas in 1999 under the Crystal version from the year 2000. This rule is more forward-thinking than you might imagine. Nowadays, it is common practice for games to be in fundamentally altered states years after release. I mean, just look at No Man's Sky or Cyberpunk 2077. Destiny is in no way anything like it was during its initial launch. If you want to experience that original version, you'd have to track down a physical copy and not download any updates, which means you can't play the game online, effectively negating almost any point in playing the game since multiplayer is such a crucial part of the experience. No one is, or ever will bother with the vanilla version of that game again, except to satisfy an estranged curiosity. While multiplayer experiences aren't easily quantifiable because they aren't transferable, in the case of Destiny, the multiplayer components heavily alter the single-player experience, and that cannot be ignored. In light of all this, we've decided to accept future versions under the idea that we are recommending Pokemon Gold and Silver, but it comes with an update patch that you may as well play instead, that being Crystal. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes of those original titles, are far enough away from the original release that they will be eligible to compete as separate entries. Though, off the record, I will say that this will more than likely be a rare occurrence. Eventually, a game like the new Resident Evil remakes come along and are so graphically different that they may compete again. Though I do want to stress that they need to be truly exceptional remakes. And as usual, the Academy reserves the right to disqualify a remake if it is deemed to be not a significant enough of an improvement, or alteration. All this to say, games are an extremely complex and endlessly challenging art form because there is always so much alteration made, not just by the player, but the designers and fans alike. Even if we can resolve a technical issue like the controls in Doom, what do we do when the changes actually cross cultures and language? For this part of the discussion, I'm going to need two new examples, that being Snatcher and Dragon Quest V. Both are titles competing this season in 1992. The Western release of Snatcher for the Sega CD has a few key changes about the tone of the main character. You can look up the specifics yourself, but suffice to say, protagonist Gillian is even more of a sleazy hoe than he is in the Western release. On the one hand, there's an argument to be made that we should favor the original Japanese version, since that's more in line with the creator's vision. However, to do so would, in effect, be to proclaim my friends and I, as Americans, have any right to tell the Japanese how great art should be made. What I mean by that is, Gillian was written primarily for a Japanese audience, and their perspective of the character's actions is filtered through their cultural lens, which then serves to add credibility to the execution of the character. If we extract that and apply our Western ideals as the lens, it distorts the message being conveyed and is, in my view, basically a small form of appropriation at that point. It's one thing if something is culturally context sensitive. To give an example, one of my favorite films is Wolf Children, a Japanese anime. I originally watched this film for a college class, and we used it to discuss some of the ways the film reflects and critiques contemporary Japanese society. And while that was an interesting conversation, for me, I loved the movie for its depiction of siblings growing apart, having dual identities, and the conflicting values of nature versus social life. These themes are all present in the film, and I'm sure many Japanese understand the film in that way. But even so, it's disingenuous of me to assume this provides me some kind of perfect clarity on another culture's perspective. The film resonates with me because of my lived experiences here on the west coast of the United States, and the themes I mentioned happen to be very prevalent for myself and many others. In more recent years, Japan has become a more individualistic society in many ways. And since the United States is very much an individualistic society as well, it's not surprising that certain portrayals will simply make more sense for both cultures. It's kind of like when a male writer writes from a female perspective or vice versa. There's nothing wrong with it on principle, but art has elements of unconscious bias that informs the piece in intrinsically nuanced ways. For those who are an expert on the subject of, say, sex and gender, they will notice more acutely when the artist has let the extent of their knowledge show. And then there's the whole issue of language. Snatcher was originally written in Japanese, which none of the voters can read, and even if they could, can we honestly recommend a game with no English translation when our audience is very clearly English speakers? Enter Dragon Quest V. This game never received a US release nor an official English version at all. There are remakes and remasters of Dragon Quest V in English, but not only do they change the game in fundamental ways, they are released far later than the level playing field we just got done establishing. There does exist, however, a fan translation of the original Super Nintendo version, which you can patch into the ROM, or simply download with it, and play the game that way. Normally, we can't allow mods for obvious reasons, but in this case, it's the difference between playing the game or ignoring it entirely. It might be simpler to just ignore the game, but like Doom, the patched ROM does exist, and while it might not be a perfect translation, ultimately no translation is perfect. In fact, translation can never be perfect, but rather you approximate crucial details in an attempt to convey something new that closely mirrors the important essence in the meaning that was said. Of course, we could just play a version that released officially in the US with a publisher-approved translation, but once you cross generational gaps, the playing field can feel uneven very quickly. As an amendment to the 5-year rule, we're going to be conscientious about console generations and technical capacity for the season so that every game is competing at their best, but also in a way that is fair. This is a really hard rule to put down in words, but it is one of those things that I think most people know it when they see it. A 3DS version of Dragon Quest V with an extended script and design philosophies that reflect more modern Dragon Quest games is a fine version for us to recommend, but it's not a version that is fair to compete against a game like Contra 3, which is firmly limited to Super Nintendo hardware. Similarly, a PlayStation port of Dragon Quest V isn't really fair when the PlayStation console won't exist until after 1992. So what have we covered so far? Well, we know that the game should ideally submit a singular version, or as few as possible, to prevent from bad ports contradicting nomination credibility. We know that the game requires an English localization, and we accept that might mean accepting some changes that ultimately prevent us from talking over a culture, or getting confused or bothered by it, and that sometimes the way in which we get the English translation might be a bit awkward. And finally, even though we should feel free to choose the best version of a game, we do need to be careful of time and fairness among accessible developer tools and cultural trends. Given this, I have written out some new rulings that reflect our discussions internally, so from now on, here are our extensive eligibility rules. Rule number 1, the game must include an English version. Translation may be a result of game options, different ports, or fan patches, provided they are reasonably faithful to the source material. Exceptions may be allowed where games have extremely minimal text. Rule number 2. The year for which a game is eligible to compete must correlate with the earliest release date on record, regardless of region, for a dedicated gaming console or PC platform. Exceptions exist if the earliest version is before 1990. This rule matters quite a bit for Snatcher, actually. That game originally released in 1988 on the MSX2. Our earliest year covered is 1990 though, and given that the 92 version of Snatcher has an official English language version where the other one did not, it also has vastly updated visuals, voice acting, and completes the story that was originally unfinished, we deemed it fair to compete with its 92 version. Rule number 3, it has to be 75% video game content, but may include any components that came in the packaging with the release of the game. This mostly has to do with last season. There was a bit of an issue since there was some discrepancy over whether or not Loom's audio drama should factor into our decision making for Loom. We went with the stance that it should count since it was included with all purchased copies of Loom, making it something that would have been attached to the game if it were possible. Remember that The Secret of Monkey Island released with, I think, 6 or 8 separate tapes to play the full game? I mean, even more modern examples like Lord of the Rings: The Third Age and Mass Effect 2 released with multiple discs. With digital media, the content can be stuffed into a single download, but that simply wasn't possible back in the day. And developers used media formats beyond digital computers to help immerse players. At the very least, you need a controller or a keyboard and a TV to play the game at all. That said, we don't want to include board games or computer games that facilitate or necessitate external media to a large degree. We do have to draw the line somewhere. Rule number 4. Game content must be 75% original or artfully repurposed materials, and this is to prevent asset flips. Rule number 5. Only one version of a game will be eligible to compete in its competitive season, the version of which will be decided on a case-by-case basis by the Academy. Voters may submit an alternative version of a game to take the place of the original, but only if it is within 5 years of the game's first release, and only if that version does not exist as a representation of a massive change in either technical advancements or design philosophies, i.e. cultural trends. Now that said, any version of a game is eligible for use for ceremony presentation purposes, assuming it is a version that does not drastically misrepresent the original material, or in such cases where the original game footage is somehow inaccessible. And rule number 6. While the game's official and original release date determines its year of competition, the experienced version and the method through which voters may enjoy a game need not be done in its first iteration. Game remasters or viewing gameplay may be used in addition, or as a replacement for, first-hand experience. However, judges are required to use these methods only as an approximation for the authentic experience. Whew. Okay, I hope this provides some clarity and justification for the choices we will make in the future. I said from the beginning that games should compete at the earliest point in time they became available, but also that they should compete in the best possible form. These two things do not always line up perfectly, so what the mini chairman and I have done is brainstorm a rule set that hopefully accommodates both the authentic timeline of the game experience without insensitively discrediting the meaningful, but ultimately unremarkable changes that games undergo as a digital art form. Now that that's settled, it's time to talk about some category name changes. There are 3 in total, and the descriptions of each is not changing beyond some slight rewording for clarity. We are, however, changing 3 category titles to have them better reflect what the description is looking for. However, there is a 4th category in which we will be more extensively changing the description and not the title. So let's get that one out of the way first. We debated changing best level design to best scenario design on the grounds that not every game has clearly defined levels. And so we want to be sure that when we're voting, the title does not overlook games like The Secret of Monkey Island or Super Metroid, games that do not have clearly delineated stages. But after some reflection, I decided that level design is a term most people are more familiar with, and it still encompasses one half of the category. So rather than try to confuse everyone, I have updated the description to read as such. Best level design awards excellence in gameplay, conveyance, and theatrical presentation of the game's scenarios. This involves the difficulty ascension, where applicable, and narrative-driven atmosphere for the player to journey through. It encompasses the progression and flow of the experience, including implementation of theme and variation, the segmentation of locales or stages, obstacles, scene division, and gameplay length are also considerations. The main reason I bring all this up is that I want people to know that when we say level design, we also mean scenario design. Castlevania IV won this category last season, specifically on the grounds that not only were its obstacle courses a great deal of fun to traverse, but it also had memorable set pieces to explore, which helped convey the sense of a large-scale castle. That theatric was an important factor for us, so this change should help with points of that nature. In other words, level design is all about the context for which all other components take place in, chief among them being gameplay and conceptual design for the places the player gets to venture through. It's not exclusively about game balance, but neither is it exclusively about the ideas beyond what you'll encounter. So that's our adjustment for level design. Now let's talk about category name changes. The first on our list is Best Visual Immersion, which will now be called Best Technical Artistry. This one is probably the biggest change for a number of reasons. For myself, I don't really like the word immersion because it's very ambiguous to its meaning. As written, you could argue a game like Dr. Mario is visually immersive because of its simplicity, but this is our one technical focused category, so I want the nominees to reflect aspects like AI, physics, hitboxes, software performance, and creative engineering that work together to build a believably compelling space to interact with. We considered calling it Best Visual Engineering, Best Engagement, and Best Technical Ingenuity, but none of these solved the larger problem of 1, separating themselves from the other visual-focused categories, and 2, staying true to the artistic use of programming rather than its raw technical side. Computer games depend on engineers to exist, so we obviously need to have at least one category that acknowledges this front. But because we are an organization all about uplifting the arts, it is important for each category to have an art concentration as well. In the end, we agreed, mostly, that Best Technical Artistry helps clarify that the specifics of the game concern itself with the authenticity of the spaces it creates and the degree and kind of spectacle therein. Castlevania won this category last year also, despite its frame rate issues. While poor frame rate can count against you, among the 5 nominees, Castlevania provided an overwhelming amount of visual nuance. Its many unique environments put the immersion factor through the roof. No shade on Dr. Mario, but what it does well really comes down to its interface and gameplay, whereas Castlevania shot for the stars and reached the moon. A game like F-Zero was perhaps the most technically well-built title, but it's not worthwhile to simply document an objective best. By adding artistry to the title, we are setting an expectation on clever, innovative, or impressive technical design practices in games that help the experience become more inspiring and enjoyable. From that lens, Castlevania 4 is more than deserving of its unanimous win. I should also mention the potential overlap with sound atmosphere here. Atmosphere is another ambiguous word like immersion. The difference is sound atmosphere doesn't have any overlap with the other two audio categories, as those are both music related. However, you could theoretically argue that atmospheric sound helps create a more immersive environment, which is true. Ultimately though, all sound effects, sound design, and anything non-music sound related aspect should be encompassed in sound atmosphere. Technical artistry is under the larger banner of the visual categories, which I color code in blue on the ballot, so it'll be pretty hard to confuse the two. And finally, technical artistry is considered a visual category because the end result of the programming ingenuity will largely be experienced in a visual way. We could change sound atmosphere to sound artistry, but for now, sound atmosphere means much the same and has yet to lead to confusion like visual immersion was causing. Speaking of music, next up is Best Musical Score, which will now be called Best Original Score. The reason this is changing is that even though the category description states that the music must be originally composed for the game in question, we've run into not one, not two, but three conflicting debates about this internally. The first was for Loom last year, the second was for Hook this year, and the final was for King Arthur's World also this season. All of those games have great music, but they are recreations of music that was not written for the game specifically, or in the case of King Arthur's World, not enough of it was original. And while we could open those doors, it is a highly competitive category already, and I really feel that at the end of the day, all the best score nominees should honor music that was written and recorded specifically to complement and enhance the gameplay experience. Last year's winner was Arcus Odyssey, which elevated that game by an enormous degree. In fact, I would venture to suggest it may not even have been nominated for anything else had it not come with a score that captured our imagination so well. That is an achievement that shouldn't go to a composer who wrote music for a different art medium, performance, or with different intentions entirely. Furthermore, Best Score should honor music that helps enhance play and assist in telling the story or aesthetic themes of the game's experience. So in the end, I decided that the Oscars don't own the word original no more than any other award show owns the phrase art direction. Original music, like art direction, is simply one aspect that contributes to the creation of a compelling game world, and its goals, while similar to a movie score, can often have very different priorities. But such priorities are still accurately contained within the title of Best Original Score. Finally, the final name change is for Best Musical Track, which will now be called Best Music Track. There's no deep or insightful reason behind this. I simply felt that the word musical is too closely associated with actual musicals, as in like movie musicals. Whereas now we can look at any track from a game's score. There's never going to be a year where we won't have compelling game scores to nominate. So music track is in some sense a way to have 10 music nominees rather than 5. Obviously, it is different in that it looks much closer at the composition of the music by itself, but it may also more deeply consider the influence a single track can have at key points in the game. Last year's winner was Castlevania again for the track Waterfall, which I argued held crucial artistic messaging that was important for conveying the cathartic resonance the overall experience had to give. Calling this musical sort of skews the meaning of the category to focus on things that are musical in nature, as opposed to being open to whatever argument the voters come up with. Some argue the compositional achievement in the song, while others focus more on iconography, while still others talk about purpose and narrative coherence, and this wide range of choices means the category title should support that kind of dynamic conversation. We've also updated this category description to be more open-ended. Since music track is more about the song itself and its strength as a piece of music or as a way to ignite interest in the game and its themes, we decided that this category has an exception. We may nominate any version of a song for music track so long as it was officially sanctioned by the owners of the intellectual property. This means we can nominate a single track from Doom's awesome 3DO soundtrack because our recommendation is, on some level, to listen to the song absent of the gameplay. This exception does not include fan covers, however, and must still abide by the 5-year release window rule. So there you have it for the name changes, mostly small, but with some important implications. I sincerely don't think our votes would have changed last season, or at least not significantly enough to flip a win, since it seems to me we made our choices factoring the category descriptions in mind. The descriptions revealed themselves in our in-person debate, but these changes will make things clearer for everyone in the future. A good category title is simple to say, easy to remember, and most of all, clearly communicates what aspect the game is most interested in. We're about to wrap up, but I wanted to close this video out by sharing the shortlist for Season 2 of the Oscarinas. As a reminder, the shortlist dictates which games are eligible for nominations. The cap is 15 per year, and the reason for this ruling is primarily to keep my workload in check, but it also encourages the voters to consider carefully their nominations to ensure they are giving the game's deserving merit enough spotlighting. With that said, here are the games on the shortlist for 1992. Assault Suits Vulcan, Contra 3: The Alien Wars, Dragon Quest V, King Arthur's World, Lightning Force 4: Quest of the Dark Star, Lunar: The Silver Star, Shining Force, Snatcher, Soul Blazer, Star Control 2, Street Fighter 2, Streets of Rage 2, Super Mario Kart, Super Star Wars, and Ultima 7: The Black Gate. And here are the games on the shortlist for 1993. ActRaiser 2, Aladdin, Castlevania: Rondo of Blood, Doom, Gabriel Knight: Sins of the Father, Goof Troop, Ihatovo Monogatari, Illusion of Gaia, Mega Man X, Myst, Ogre Battle: March of the Black Queen, Phantasy Star 4, Sam & Max: Hit the Road, Secret of Mana, Shinobi 3: Return of the Ninja, Star Fox, and Zelda: Link's Awakening. You heard me. This season, I authorized an exception to include 2 additional entries in the year 1993. This happened because certain games garnered nominations, but then we updated the category titles and descriptions, and as a result, it shifted many of our preferences. And rather than force everyone to re-vote from scratch, it was better to just make a little extra room. There are a few other surprises as well, but I think those are going to be best left as surprises. So for now, thank you so much for stopping by. This season sees a total of 27 games receive at least 1 nomination. That's almost double than what it was last season. We're so excited to have you come on board. We worked really hard on this season, and I think it shows. So stay tuned, and we'll see you then.